Hello everyone. Before we get started, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment letting me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. That way, YouTube knows to keep sharing more stories like this with you. Now, let's jump in. I don't go up to my parents' cabin much anymore, but when I was younger, I spent a lot of time there. It sat up in Oregon, near Mount Bachelor, tucked away in a little stretch of pine woods where snow covered the ground for long stretches of winter. I have a lot of good memories there, family weekends, holidays, even lazy summers. But I also carry one memory that I've never been able to shake, one that still makes the hairs on my neck stand up even now. Years later, this trip happened not long after my dad died. He took his own life, and I was left dealing with the weight of it all, the inheritance, the questions, the guilt, and the silence. He used to tell me when I was younger that ghosts weren't real, and that I should never be afraid of the dead. Fear the living, he'd say, because they're the ones who can hurt you. Those words stuck with me. They still do. At the time, the cabin was in the process of being sold. My mom couldn't afford the payments anymore, and renting it out wasn't cutting it. It was set to go on the market in less than a month, and in that gap of time, it wasn't going to be rented out or used. It was just sitting there empty. That emptiness, that gap of time felt like an opportunity for me. I wanted space from everything, from the sympathy of coworkers, from the whispers, from the heavy air inside the house that still smelled like my dad. So I quit my job, packed up my snowboard, loaded food and liquor and cigarettes, and brought along my dog. Midnight. I drove up there in my dad's old car, the one he left me. The drive was quiet, snowy, the kind of long stretch where your thoughts bounce around the inside of your head like echoes. By the time I got to the cabin, the sun was dipping low and the trees stood tall like walls around me. It felt familiar but also different. It wasn't a family trip anymore. It was just me and my dog. The first 2 days were normal. Almost peaceful, really. I spent the mornings outside with Midnight, watching him bound through the snow like he was born for it, his black fur speckled with white. I'd head to the slopes for a while, come back exhausted, cook something simple in the small kitchen, and spend the evenings with music, the PlayStation, or a movie. I'd sit on the balcony sometimes with a drink in one hand and a cigarette in the other, staring at the snowflakes drifting down through the pines, the quiet pressing in like a blanket. For a little while, I felt like I was unwinding, like maybe I'd made the right choice in coming here. The cabin itself was familiar, but when you're alone in a place like that, the details stand out more. The downstairs had a living room with old heavy furniture and a stone fireplace, a guest bedroom off to the side, and a kitchen that always seemed too small when more than one person was cooking. Upstairs was the master bedroom, another guest room, and a balcony that looked out over the trees. I stuck to the main rooms, the living room, the kitchen, and the master bedroom. I didn't even bother opening the doors to the other rooms. Dark, empty rooms unsettled me, even if it was my own family's cabin. Something about staring into an unused room at night, the shadows sitting too still, always made me uneasy. So I kept the doors shut tight. It was on the third day that things started to shift. Snow was coming down harder, thick enough that I didn't feel like driving out. Midnight and I stuck close to the cabin. Around midday, while he was running around outside, I noticed something that made me stop in my tracks. Footprints in the snow. They circled the cabin in places, wandering near the trees and back toward the driveway. They weren't old either. The snowfall hadn't covered them completely. They looked maybe 20 or 30 minutes fresh. My first thought was that maybe someone else had a cabin nearby. There were only two within close distance, both of them empty as far as I knew. But maybe I was wrong. Maybe someone was staying there without me noticing. People liked their privacy out here. Still, the prints led away from my cabin, into the denser stretch of trees, and then disappeared where the snow was falling heavier. I stood there a while with Midnight sniffing around, his breath puffing white in the air, his nose twitching toward the direction the prints went. I told myself it wasn't a big deal. Someone must have been hiking, maybe a hunter. Maybe just someone passing through. But the thought of someone close by who I didn't know, it made me uneasy in a way I didn't want to admit. I shook it off and went back inside. That night, when I was lying in bed, Midnight suddenly perked up. His ears shot forward, his body stiff. Then, without hesitation, he bolted off the bed and tore downstairs. My heart jumped into my throat. I stayed still, listening. I could hear him pacing around below me, his claws clicking across the wood floor, moving back and forth like he was unsettled. After a few minutes, he bounded back upstairs and stood by the bed, shifting his weight back and forth. It was his way of telling me he wanted outside. I didn't want to go, but I couldn't ignore him. So I pulled on a jacket and went downstairs with him. Outside, I expected him to go to the driveway and do his business, but he didn't. He pulled hard on the leash, dragging me toward the trees where I'd seen the prints earlier. He kept stopping to sniff along the side of the house, then looking upward toward the roof, then pulling again toward the tree line. He sat at one point just staring into the darkness, his breath steady, his eyes locked. I told myself maybe there were animals out there, deer, coyotes, whatever else lived in these woods. Midnight had a strong prey drive, so it wasn't unusual for him to fixate. But it felt different this time. The way he stared wasn't playful. It was cautious, alert. I pulled him back inside before he could drag me any further. We went back upstairs. I tried to settle in again, tried to push it out of my head. Then maybe half an hour later I heard it. Footsteps on the roof. Not heavy stomps, just a steady sequence of about 6 steps. Deliberate. Spaced apart like a person walking, not an animal scurrying. I froze. Midnight ran to the balcony door, his nose pressed to the glass, tail stiff, body tense. My brain scrambled to explain it. Maybe a pine cone dropped, maybe snow slid off a branch. But the sound hadn't been random. It had rhythm, spacing. It was footsteps. I told myself I was being ridiculous. I was young, strong, and this was my family's cabin. I wasn't about to let fear keep me pinned in bed. So I grabbed my coat, shoes, flashlight, and a cigarette. I stepped out onto the balcony. The cold hit me immediately, biting at my skin. I lit up a cigarette and shined my light across the roof. The snow was smooth, untouched. No tracks, no marks, nothing. The air was silent except for the sound of Midnight's claws tapping behind me as he paced. I let the light drop and stared out at the trees. The longer I stood there, the more my eyes adjusted. Snowflakes drifted down in the glow of the moon. The forest standing still as if it were holding its breath. And then I saw it. In a tree about 20 feet away, just taller than the cabin, something was there. At first my mind didn't register it. It looked like a man crouched between 2 branches, squatting low. Its arms were stretched up, gripping the branch above it, body balanced on the branch below. I froze. Every nerve in my body fired at once. Midnight started pacing faster, giving short, sharp barks. The figure didn't move. It just stayed there, crouched, holding on, watching. I couldn't make out details. Just the shape, the posture, the way it seemed to be fixed on me. My hand twitched toward the flashlight, but something inside me screamed not to point it at him. I backed up slowly, step by step, pulling Midnight with me. I slipped inside, shut the balcony door, and locked it. I grabbed the flashlight then and shined it toward the tree through the glass. Nothing, just branches, just snow. I pulled the curtains closed and sat on the bed, my heart hammering. Midnight stared at the door, but wouldn't go near it. Later, when I finally started to drift into a half-sleep, I heard it again, tapping at the glass. Light, steady, like fingers drumming. It went on and on, nearly an hour, and I couldn't move. I lay there listening, every muscle locked. Midnight just stared. I don't know when I finally passed out, but when I woke up, it was morning. The light of day made everything feel different. The balcony was empty, the snow untouched. No footprints, no marks, no signs of anything. The rest of the week passed quietly. Nothing else happened. No more noises, no more prints, no more shapes in the trees. I kept to my routine, but I never relaxed again. I jumped at every creak, every gust of wind. I stayed inside more, curtains drawn. Midnight stayed close, always watching the windows, always listening. When I finally left the cabin, I remember locking the door, getting into my dad's car, and looking up at the trees one last time. They stood still and silent, tall against the sky, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been up there, watching. It's been years since then. I'm married now with kids and the cabin is long gone, sold off. But I still think about that week. I tell myself it could have all been in my head. The stress and grief and isolation playing tricks on me. The mind can do that. It can bend shadows into shapes, turn branches into figures, make every noise into footsteps. I tell myself that's what happened. But even now, when the house is quiet and the dark presses in, I think about that night. About the footsteps on the roof. About the shape crouched in the tree. About the tapping on the glass. I don't believe in ghosts. I never did. My dad was right about that. It's the living you should be afraid of. And the truth is, I don't know who or what was out there in those woods. Maybe it was nobody. Maybe it was just me losing my grip for a while. But the part that stays with me isn't the fear. It's the certainty I felt, that whatever was out there wanted me to open the door, and I know without a doubt that if I had, things wouldn't have ended the same way. I remember that trip through the south of France like it's carved into my skin. A lot of the memories are soft and warm, the kind that years later feel like a different life. Hitchhiking, dusty roads, the clink of cheap beer bottles, the long waits at the side of highways with our thumbs out and backpacks digging into our shoulders. But there's one night that doesn't fade with time the way the others do. It's sharper, heavier, and it's the kind of memory that comes back uninvited when I'm lying awake in my bed. That night in the swampy patch of woods is still one of the most uncomfortable and eerie experiences I've ever had. And I think I'll carry it until the day I die. We'd been hitchhiking for weeks by then, my friend and I, moving from town to town with no real plan other than finding the next ride and the next patch of ground where we could pitch our tiny tent. We were young and reckless enough to think it was all freedom and adventure, but old enough to know how exhausting it was to never have certainty about where you'd sleep or what you'd eat. The roads blurred together after a while, the endless stretches of tar and gravel framed by fields, vineyards, or forests. Sometimes we camped hidden just outside little towns, close enough to walk to a shop or bar in the evening, but far enough that no one would stumble across us. Other nights we'd find patches of trees or the edges of fields, sometimes even setting up in places that weren't technically allowed, but felt safe enough if we kept quiet. She was always uneasy at night, no matter where we ended up. I used to joke that she had city ears, too tuned into the sounds of civilization. At night, noises carry in strange ways. Cars that were probably miles off sounded like they were right beyond the trees. Dogs barking in some far-off farm sounded like they were circling us. The hum of distant machinery would turn into a low drone, vibrating through the ground. She hated it. She'd lie there wide-eyed, clutching her sleeping bag, scribbling in her diary, and getting annoyed that I could just roll over and fall asleep like none of it existed. That day, though we'd gotten ourselves into more of a situation than usual, we'd been dropped off by some driver. He was friendly enough, but didn't take us anywhere near a good camping spot. By the time we realized we were in trouble, the sun was already sinking. Every hitchhiker knows that creeping panic of evening coming too fast, when you haven't secured a place to sleep. You can't walk on forever with packs on your back, and once the dark comes down, it becomes 10 times harder to find anything safe or hidden. We walked and walked, our shoulders aching, our feet blistered inside our worn shoes, until finally we found a stretch of dense woods. At first glance, it didn't look promising. The edges were all tangled with tall ferns that stood taller than me, thick enough that you couldn't see further than a few steps inside. But I thought I saw a break in them, a darker patch that looked like it might open up. It was already dusky and the sky was bleeding that dull orange gray that tells you you've got maybe half an hour of light left. We had to make a decision. I pushed through the ferns, hacking at them with my arms, shoving them aside so we could squeeze through. They were wet with the day's humidity and left my arms damp and sticky. The further I pushed, the worse I felt. I can't explain it properly. It wasn't anything I saw or heard, just a sudden weight in my stomach. A pull backwards, like my body was telling me to stop. I froze there, one hand pushing the ferns apart, the other gripping the strap of my bag. I looked back at her, ready to say, let's not do this. Let's just keep moving, even if it means stumbling along the road in the dark. But when I turned, she was already watching me expectantly. She was tired, sweaty, flushed, and she was waiting for me to clear the way. I knew she counted on me to always push through, to make decisions, to get us somewhere no matter how grim. And she had that look, the one that said she'd follow my lead, but only if I actually gave her something to follow. So I kept going, against what my gut was screaming at me. We broke through to the clearing, if you could even call it that. It wasn't a nice flat campsite kind of clearing. It was uneven, swampy in patches, the ground soft underfoot. There were tufts of grass mixed with bare wet patches of mud and roots curling out like broken fingers. The air smelled damp, earthy with a hint of rot, like something had been sitting wet for too long. I wanted to turn around again, but the light was dying and we had no other choice. We set up the tent on the driest bit of ground we could find, though it was still damp underneath. As we worked, I kept glancing around, scanning the tree line, but everything just looked the same. Tall ferns, thick trees, shadows moving as the last bits of sunlight filtered through. My chest felt tight and my skin prickled. Normally I was the calm one, the one who shrugged things off, but this place felt different. Maybe that's why I did something I usually never bothered with. I lit candles outside the tent. Normally we just relied on our headlamps or the little torch we shared, but that night I wanted light. Lots of it. Tiny flames flickered around us, glowing against the damp air. I even cracked open some beers I'd been saving, drinking them fast to try and push away the unease. She noticed, of course. She knew me well enough to see I wasn't myself. Instead of calming things down, it only made everything worse. The mood between us soured. We were both tired, both hungry, both sick of carrying everything we owned on our backs. She snapped at me over something small. I snapped back. And before I knew it, we were having the kind of argument that's more about the buildup of days and weeks than whatever was actually said. She was furious, angrier than I'd ever seen her, writing in her diary in sharp, aggressive lines. Normally I would have teased her or tried to make peace, but that night I just felt heavy, weighed down by the wrongness of the place. Eventually she gave up, rolled over, and tried to sleep. I lay down too, but there was no way I was switching off. My ears were wide open, straining. That's when I first noticed it. The sound. At first I thought it was just the forest settling, the way trees creak and grass shifts when the air cools. But this was different. It was like a low whisper, not words I could understand, but the kind of noise you hear when people are talking in another room, muffled but constant. It wasn't coming from one direction. It was all around, surrounding the tent. I lay there with my heart thumping, trying to convince myself it was just the swamp. Water shifting, insects moving, things like that. But it didn't sound like that. Worse than the whispering was what I heard under my head, directly beneath me. A kind of creaking, tapping, rustling. Not the soft brush of leaves, but something moving against the ground itself. I pressed my hand down, expecting to feel vibration, but there was nothing. Just damp earth and the thin fabric of the tent floor. Yet the sound didn't stop. It was so clear, as if something alive was shifting right beneath me. I started piling clothes under my head, hoping to block it out, but the sound just carried through them. It was inescapable, filling the silence between my own breath. My friend slept somehow, her breathing deep and steady, her diary half buried in the mess of our bags. I couldn't bring myself to wake her. She already hated camping, hated the sounds at night, and I couldn't pile this on her too. So I lay there, wide-eyed, staring at the thin ceiling of the tent while my stomach twisted tighter and tighter. The whispering outside went on. Sometimes it rose a little, like more voices joining in. Sometimes it faded, but it never stopped. Every time I thought maybe it was just my mind playing tricks, I'd hear a clear shift beneath my head again. That scraping, that creak, and my body would jolt with panic. I felt sick, actually sick with the anxiety. I don't think I slept more than a few minutes at a time, if at all. When the first light came through, pale and cold, I felt like I'd been through a war. I shook her awake, told her we needed to pack up quickly. She groaned, confused, asking why the rush, but I brushed it off. I didn't want to talk about it, didn't want to plant the same fear in her head. She stretched, yawning, in a better mood than the night before, saying she'd finally gotten some decent sleep for once. I forced a smile and didn't answer. As we pulled the tent up, I noticed the ground underneath. It was crawling with ants, thick black trails weaving in and out of the damp soil. Our bags and shoes were dotted with them. Maybe we'd pitched right on top of a nest. That would explain some of the sounds, maybe. But I couldn't convince myself that ants could make the kind of whispering I'd heard, or the creaks and taps that had felt so deliberate, so close. Still, I didn't argue with myself. I just wanted out. We stumbled back through the tall ferns, scratched and bitten, our skin raw from midges or mosquitoes. My arms were covered in angry red welts, my ankles sore. The swampy air clung to me even as we got back onto the road. All I could think was how wrong that place had felt, like we'd forced ourselves into somewhere we weren't supposed to be. We didn't talk much that morning. She was cheerful, laughing at the angry diary entries she'd written, joking about how ridiculous she'd been. I laughed along, but inside I felt heavy, drained. That night had marked me. The whispering, the movement under my head, the sick feeling that something wasn't right. I couldn't explain it, and I didn't want to try. Some places just aren't meant for people, and we'd found one of them. I've camped plenty since then, in forests, fields, mountains, beaches. Some nights are hard, some are easy, but nothing has ever felt like that swamp in the south of France. It wasn't dramatic, nothing chased us, nothing obvious happened, but it was enough. Enough to remind me that sometimes when your gut tells you to turn back, you should listen, because the worst nights aren't the ones where something happens. They're the ones where nothing does, but you're left knowing you were too close to something you didn't understand. And for me, that night was exactly that. We left with bites, damp clothes, and a tent that smelled of rot. But I also left with the memory of lying wide awake, hearing whispers all around me, and the creaking shift of something I could never see beneath my head. That was the night I learned that unease can be louder than fear, and that some places carry a weight you don't ever want to touch again. I had been going out into those woods for years, long before I ever thought about spending the night there. At first it was just hiking during the day, walking the same trails, learning the landmarks, getting used to the way the ground sloped and the way the light filtered through the canopy. Over time, I felt like I knew the place, like it was almost an extension of my backyard. I knew the old hunting blinds nailed into trees, the faded spray paint from teenagers who used to play paintball out there, the natural clearings, and the sound of water trickling through the shallow creeks when the rain had been steady enough. It wasn't just about the woods themselves. For me, there was something comforting in being out there with no one else around. The quiet was its own kind of company. I liked the idea of being self-sufficient, building a fire, making a shelter, setting up camp. It stripped away a lot of noise from everyday life and left just me, the trees, and the night sky. That was the appeal. The first time I decided to stay overnight out there, I didn't go alone. I brought my dog with me. She was medium-sized, strong, with that instinct that seems to never shut off when she's outside. Her ears flicked at every sound. Her nose worked the air constantly, and she always seemed to know if something was near before I had a clue. That gave me some confidence. She wasn't just a pet. She was another set of senses to rely on. And in the woods at night, that mattered. We headed out in the late afternoon, walking the narrow trail until it opened into the spot I had in mind. I knew about some old wooden frames built into a couple of trees, probably left behind years ago from people who used the area for paintball. They weren't much to look at, but they gave me the idea of a sheltered place to set up. I gathered branches and leaned them against the frame, layering pine boughs and sticks until I had something that would break the wind. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough to call a lean-to. Once that was up, I turned my attention to the fire. I cleared a patch of ground, ringed it with rocks, and started breaking down dry branches into manageable pieces. There's a rhythm to it that I always liked. The snap of twigs, the smell of pine resin, the way smoke curls upward when the first flame catches. By the time the fire was going steady, the light had started fading, and I boiled some water for a simple meal. My dog ate her share too, sitting close, her head occasionally lifting at the sounds from the darkness beyond the glow. When we finally settled in, the fire was nothing but a steady bed of coals. The air was cool, and the ground beneath me was hard but not unbearable. I lay back in the shelter, my dog stretched out beside me, and tried to let the crackle of the fire and the rustling of the leaves lull me into sleep. That's when I heard it. At first, it was faint, like a long hiss, but not quite. The closest thing I could compare it to was the sound of air being pumped out of a bicycle pump, that hollow rush of pressure being released. But this was louder. It carried through the trees and it didn't fade. It was steady, as if something alive was producing it, and it was moving. Getting closer, my dog was on her feet before I was. Her head was low, her body stiff, a low growl rumbling in her chest. The hairs on her back were raised like a brush, and her attention was locked in one direction. That alone sent a jolt through me. I tried to convince myself it could be anything. A deer exhaling sharply, a raccoon rummaging. But the sound was wrong. It didn't come in bursts. It was continuous, deliberate, closing in. I reached into the fire pit and pulled out a thick branch I had left burning at the end. The flame licked up into the night as I lifted it, making the shadows dance across the trees. The torch was my reassurance, something to hold between me and whatever was out there. With my dog on the leash in one hand and the torch in the other, I stepped out of the lean-to and faced the dark. The sound didn't stop. If anything, it grew louder, sharper, more forceful. It felt directed, as if the thing making it knew exactly where we were. My dog's growl turned into sharp barks, but she stayed close. Her body coiled tight as if she was ready to lunge if I let her. I shouted, swinging the torch in wide arcs, trying to send the message that I wasn't something to mess with. I wanted the flames to show strength, to create light and fear. In most cases, wild animals don't want to get near fire or noise. That was the logic I was holding on to. But instead of retreating, the sound moved quicker, cutting through the trees with purpose. I could hear twigs snapping now, underbrush parting. Whatever it wasn't afraid of me, and it wasn't turning back. Every instinct screamed that I was making a mistake by staying. I thought about my dog, how she would throw herself at it without hesitation if it came too close. The thought of her tangling with something out there, something bold enough to approach fire and shouting, was enough to push me into action. I stomped out the fire in a rush, kicking dirt over the coals, smothering the light until the night swallowed us whole. Gripping the leash tight, I turned us back toward the trail and started moving fast. The sound followed, 3/4 of a mile. That's how far we had to go to reach the edge of the woods and back toward home. The hissing, rushing noise stayed behind us, sometimes closer, sometimes further, but never gone. My dog snarled and growled the whole way, whipping her head toward the sound as we hurried along the trail. Every step felt like walking a razor's edge. I expected at any second to see glowing eyes flash in the dark, or hear the rush of something lunging through the brush. But it never happened. The sound just tracked us, steady and relentless, until finally the trees began to thin, and the familiar shape of the road came into view. By the time we stepped out of the woods, the noise stopped. Just like that, gone. I didn't turn around to see if it lingered. I just walked straight home, my dog at my side. Her body still tense, but her breathing slowing with each step away from the tree line. That night, sleep didn't come easy. Every little creak of the house or a shift of wind outside sounded like that hiss creeping back toward me. The second time I went out there, I went alone. It wasn't because I thought the first experience hadn't been real. I knew it had. But something about the woods drew me back anyway. Maybe it was stubbornness. Maybe it was the belief that one bad night didn't erase years of good ones. Either way, I packed up my things and hiked in, going deeper this time. The place I picked was farther off the main trail, tucked between a rise in the land and a thick cluster of pines. It felt more enclosed, more hidden, as if I had carved out a little corner of the forest for myself. I built the shelter bigger this time, layering more branches until the walls had real thickness. I gathered pine needles and branches to create a softer bedding, something to keep me off the cold dirt. Dinner came and went without trouble. The fire burned strong at the mouth of the shelter, casting light that flickered over the rough shape of the walls. I thought I saw eyes once, small glimmers in the distance, but they didn't come closer. And they didn't carry the warning sound I remembered from before. I told myself it was just deer or raccoon, the usual watchers of the night. I lay down, the fire warm against my face, and let myself drift. For an hour or two I slept. Then the world tore itself open. The sound of hooves pounded against the trail just feet away from me. So loud and sudden it ripped me out of sleep with my heart hammering. The ground seemed to shake with the weight of it, sharp and fast like a warning shot of raw power. I sat upright, breath held, listening as two large shapes thundered past, their bodies a blur in the dark beyond the firelight. Deer. Had to be deer. But deer don't run like that without a reason. The reason came seconds later. A chorus of yips and howls exploded through the trees. A whole pack tearing down the same trail, chasing after the deer with wild urgency. Coyotes at least half a dozen, their voices overlapping, echoing through the dark as their paws crashed against the ground. The noise filled the air, primal and hungry, and then passed just as quickly, fading in the same direction the deer had gone. But not all of them left. I heard them slow near my camp, paws shuffling against the dirt, low growls and short whines carrying in the dark. They were close enough that I could hear them breathing, circling, testing the air heavy with smoke and pine. I stoked the fire with every bit of wood I had piled nearby, the flames leaping higher, throwing sparks into the night. My heart slammed against my ribs, every muscle locked, waiting to see if they would try to close in. A lone person in the woods, unarmed, was nothing compared to the strength of a pack. But fire has a power of its own, and humans shouting are not easy prey. I yelled once, a raw sound from my chest, more out of instinct than plan. The noise cut through the night, and the coyotes answered with their own calls, sharp and mocking, before finally moving on. Their footsteps faded, swallowed by the trees, until I was alone again with the fire's crackle. I didn't sleep much after that. Every sound set me on edge. Every shadow felt like it held something waiting. I lasted until morning, but it wasn't peace, it was endurance. That was the last time I camped deep in those woods. I still go out there sometimes. In the daylight, walking the trails, listening to the familiar creak of branches and the wind shifting through the canopy. But when the sun drops, I make sure I'm headed home. Those 2 nights taught me enough. The woods aren't evil. They aren't haunted or cursed. They're just alive in a way that most of us forget when we live behind walls and under electric light. Out there, you're not at the top of the chain. You're just another body in the dark, sharing space with things that move quicker, hear better, and don't care about your comfort. For me, the lesson was simple and clear. The woods are beautiful, and they give you peace if you treat them with respect. But they also remind you that you don't belong to them. You're a visitor, nothing more. And sometimes visitors aren't welcome to stay the night. I was about 12 years old, give or take. Somewhere around 2007 or 2008. That was the year my dad decided we were finally going to make the trip up to Cape York. It was something he had talked about for as long as I could remember. Always saying, one day we'll drive north. See it all. For us, living down in Bundaberg, Queensland, Cape York wasn't just a little road trip. It was days and days of driving. Endless stretches of highway, small towns, roadhouses, and nothing but trees and sky in between. We set off with no real rush. That's the way Dad liked it. He wasn't the type to push for 16-hour days behind the wheel. He wanted to stop, stretch his legs, check out anything interesting along the way. I didn't mind either, being 12 and just happy to be along for the ride. We had the old 4-wheel drive loaded up, camping gear stuffed in the back, food, water, fishing rods, and the kind of junk you always end up packing when you think you'll need it, but never do. I remember the days kind of blending together. Town after town, long roads with hardly another car on them, the heat shimmering on the bitumen. I'd watch the bush roll by, sometimes reading a comic or playing with whatever little gadget I had, but mostly just staring out the window. Dad always had music going. Old CDs he kept in a glove box, some of it classic rock, some of it country. At night, we'd find some little motel or camp spot, sometimes just pull off into a free camping area and roll out the swags. It was late one night, maybe around 10:30 when we finally rolled into Cairns. I remember it so clearly because we were both buzzing with excitement. Cairns felt like the gateway. Past there was the Daintree, the river crossings, the wild country, the Cape itself. It felt like stepping over a threshold. Dad said we'd stay with my uncle for a few days before pressing further north. We hadn't seen him in a long while. My uncle was a bit of a character, even by our family's standards. Straight out of the 70s kind of bloke. Long hair, beard, round linen glasses. The type who always had a guitar somewhere nearby and smelled faintly of pot. He was laid back in a way that made you wonder if he'd ever truly stressed about anything in his life. But he was also sharp, clever, and always had some story to tell. Fishing was one of his big loves, and he knew the Daintree like the back of his hand. The next morning, true to form, he was already making plans. We'd go fishing with him. He had a little tinny, nothing flash, but he swore it was all you needed. By 6 a.m., we were pushing off into the water. The day passed in that lazy way fishing trips do. Lines in, lines out. The occasional bite that got your hopes up, then nothing. We didn't catch much worth bragging about, but the entertainment came from Uncle's endless stories. Some of them were funny, some were about old mates or places he'd been, some about fishing trips gone wrong. The sun climbed, the day grew hot, and then slowly, lazily, it began to dip again. As the evening settled in, Uncle steered us over to a spit of white sand along the edge of the river. It looked like something out of a postcard, a little private beach tucked into the bends of the Daintree. He said we'd cook up a lamb roast right there, campfire oven style, and hang around for a bit before heading back. Dad looked a little unsure about the idea of staying out after dark, but Uncle just laughed it off. He insisted he knew these waters better than most, that he could find his way back in the dark without a worry. Now, anyone who spent time in the Daintree knows one thing. It's crocodile country. Not the small kind either. Saltwater crocs. Big prehistoric bastards that will kill you quick if you're in the wrong place at the wrong time. I'd heard enough about them growing up, and Dad had always warned me never to get too comfortable near rivers in the north. But Uncle brushed it off in his casual way. He reckoned the crocs didn't usually come this far out. Said the water was too cold for them to hang around. Dad seemed half convinced, and I was 12 and trusted what I was told, so we let it slide. We set up on the sand. The fire glowed, the smell of roasting lamb drifted through the air, and the sky went from pink to deep purple to black. Out there, away from towns and streetlights, the night was heavy, thick, full of insect sounds and the occasional splash from the water. The stars were so bright they looked close enough to touch. At first, everything felt normal. Uncle was chatting away, Dad was relaxing, and I was poking at the fire with a stick. But after a while, I noticed Uncle wasn't talking anymore. He was just sitting there listening, his head tilted slightly, eyes fixed toward the line of mangroves a little way off. Dad noticed too. The fire popped and crackled, but other than that, it was quiet. Uncle suddenly raised his hand, a little motion for us to hush. We went still, my ears strained, but I couldn't hear anything unusual. The usual chirping of insects, a bit of rustling from the breeze, nothing more. But Uncle was tense in a way I'd never seen him before. He was usually the most relaxed person in any room, but right then he looked wired, like every muscle in him was on edge. Without a word, he stood up. His feet moved quietly over the sand, and he headed toward the tinny. From it he pulled out this long bamboo spear. I remembered asking him about it earlier in the day. He'd said it was just something he kept handy, for when crocs got too close to the boat. He'd give them a jab, they'd back off, and that would be that. At the time it had sounded almost funny. Now, watching him walk back toward the dark mangroves with that spear in his hands, it wasn't funny at all. He crept a few steps closer to the tree line. The firelight flickering against his back, the spear stretched out in front of him. Then in one sharp motion he jabbed it deep into the mangroves. The sound that came next is burned into my memory forever. A massive splash erupted, violent and sudden, followed by the thrashing of something huge tearing through the water. It moved so fast it was almost a blur, the surface of the river exploding as the thing powered away. The sound was heavy, powerful, a body of muscle and scales ripping through the water at terrifying speed. I didn't see it properly, just the flash of movement, the wake it left, and the noise. God, the noise. You don't forget the sound of something that big moving that fast, especially when you realize it had been barely feet away from you the whole time. Dad and I just froze, our stomachs dropping, the reality hitting hard. We had been sitting there, laughing, cooking, drinking, completely oblivious, while that monster had been lying in wait in the shadows of the mangroves, close enough to take one of us if we'd wandered too near. If either of us had gone for a piss in that direction, we would have been gone. No chance to scream, no chance to fight, just gone. Uncle didn't waste time. He turned, eyes wide but steady, and said nothing. He just pointed at the tinny. That was all it took. We packed up in silence as quick as we could, throwing things into bags, stamping out the fire. The lamb roast was left half-cooked in the coals. None of us cared anymore. Every second that passed felt like borrowed time. Like that croc, or another one, could come back any moment. We shoved off into the river, the tinny rocking under our weight, and Uncle gunned the motor. The boat cut across the dark water, the air cool against my face, but my chest was tight. My hands gripping the side so hard my knuckles hurt. Every ripple, every shadow, I imagined another one of those monsters rising up from below. The ride back was longer than it should have been, though in truth Uncle handled it with the skill of someone who had done it 1,000 times. Still, the night seemed darker, the water more alive, like the whole river was watching us. None of us spoke a word. When we finally hit the bank and pulled the boat up, I felt my legs shaking as I stepped onto solid ground. My stomach was still twisted, my heart still racing. Dad's face was pale, set in a hard line I didn't see often. Uncle, though calm on the surface, had that same edge in his eyes, like he knew just how close it had been. That night, lying in bed at his place, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw it again. The way he jabbed into the mangroves. The explosion of sound and movement. The realization of what had been sitting there, hidden in the dark. It wasn't some distant threat. It wasn't an old story told by locals to scare tourists. It was right there with us, silent, patient, inches away. And that's what scared me the most. How easy it would have been. How close we came without even knowing. One step too far. One walk into the shadows and I wouldn't be here to remember it. Even now, years later, whenever someone talks about the Daintree, that's the first thing that comes back to me. Not the fishing, not the stories, not the fire or the stars. Just that moment when the water exploded and we realized how close death had been. Waiting quiet and still while we laughed and cooked our dinner. That night taught me something I've never forgotten. In places like that, you aren't in charge. The river, the bush, the creatures that live there, they're in charge. And if you forget that, even for a second, you might not get a chance to remember again. I remember the day clearly, though it's been years. It was one of those gray, quiet mornings in late summer, when the air feels heavy and damp. and you can smell moss and dirt before you even step into the woods. I had been wandering the forests of upstate New York for years. Just trails, gorges, and streams. Nothing unusual for me. That morning I wanted to get away from everything. Away from people and noise and just disappear into the trees for a while. The woods up there have a certain mood to them. You can walk for miles without hearing anything but your own feet on wet leaves or the trickle of water running down the rocks. Even when the wind picks up, it doesn't sound like a breeze. It sounds like a low whisper moving through the trees, brushing the tops of the pines, carrying with it the faint smell of wet stone. I set off early, carrying nothing but a small backpack with water, a snack, and my pocket knife. The gorge I wanted to explore was one I had seen on a map but never actually hiked. It was marked by a thin blue line where a stream cut through, widening in places before narrowing again. I figured it would be like dozens of others I'd been to. Quiet, secluded, maybe a little steep, but nothing I couldn't handle. When I reached it, the first thing I noticed was the sound. Even before I saw the waterfall, I heard it. The water was steady, not roaring, but heavy enough that it stood out from the silence of the forest. I followed the sound down a slope until I reached the stream, and there it was. A waterfall maybe 20 feet tall, spilling into a shallow pool below. It wasn't massive, not the kind of waterfall you'd find on a postcard, but it was beautiful in its own way, hidden deep in the woods with no one else around. I stood there for a while, just watching. The water sparkled even under the overcast sky, and the rocks around it were slick with moss. The air was cooler near the water, carrying that sharp, clean smell that only comes from streams cutting through stone. For some reason, I felt pulled to climb up, to see what was above it. The rocks on the side were rough and jagged, and with a little effort, I scrambled up to the top. At the top, the water spread out, flat and calm for about a dozen yards, as if it was taking a breath before dropping again into the gorge. The trees leaned close overhead, and their branches swayed gently, letting slivers of light through. The stream bent around a corner a short distance away, where the ground narrowed into cliffs on both sides. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was just another pile of rocks. Nothing unusual in a stream like that. But as I got closer, I realized it wasn't random at all. It was built, deliberately. An altar. It stood right in the middle of the stream, water rushing around it. It was about 3 feet by 5 feet and 4 feet high, made out of flat stones stacked carefully. Not like a cairn you'd see marking a trail, but like something with a purpose. Tucked between the stones were objects. Glass bottles of liquor, some empty, some half full. Their labels worn from water and sun. Knives lay scattered too, their blades dull with rust, their handles swollen from moisture. The sight of them made my stomach twist. I froze, staring. Something about it felt wrong, out of place. Not just because it was strange to see in the middle of the woods, but because it was clear that someone had put it there intentionally, and not long ago. I forced myself to look around carefully. On one side of the stream, the ground rose into a sheer cliff. On the other side was a small bank, maybe 10 feet wide, before another cliff shot up. It created a narrow, boxed-in feeling, as if the gorge itself was holding everything in. I crouched low, moving slowly, scanning every inch of the bank. At first it looked like nothing but rocks and undergrowth. But the longer I looked, the more I realized it wasn't natural. Someone had built walls out of flat stones, waist high, forming crude seats around a clear space, like a gathering spot. And scattered around were things. Not trash, not forgotten camping gear. Things that made my skin prickle. There were shirts, worn and damp, pieces of cloth torn and twisted. A machete lay half buried in the dirt, its blade dark with stains I didn't want to think about. A saw leaned against one of the stone walls, its teeth sharp even with rust. Rope lay coiled in the mud, thick and frayed. The longer I stood there, the stronger the weight in my chest grew. The sound of the water filled my ears, but I could still hear my own pulse hammering. My first thought was to get out, to back down the waterfall and forget I had ever seen any of this. But instead, I just stood there, straining to hear anything beyond the stream. That's when it hit me. If someone was around that bend in the gorge, I'd never know. The bank dropped about 5 feet where the water curved out of sight, leaving a perfect blind spot. Someone could be standing there right now, watching, waiting. I crouched lower, barely breathing, every sense on edge. The air felt colder suddenly, though I knew it was just the sweat cooling on my skin. My palms were slick. I scanned the cliffs, the ridges, the trees above, trying to spot any movement. For 5 solid minutes, I didn't move, just let my eyes adjust, listening. The only sound was the steady rush of the stream and the occasional groan of trees shifting in the wind. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. Instead of turning back, I crept forward as quiet as I could toward the bend. It was stupid, reckless, I knew that. But curiosity overpowered fear. I crouched down, inching closer, until I was pressed against the drop where the bank gave way. I felt like a hobbit hiding from a ringwraith, except my chest was tight, and I was sure I'd give myself away just from the sound of my own breathing. I leaned slowly over the edge, peeking up the gorge. Nothing, just rocks and water disappearing into the distance. I waited there for what felt like forever. Then all at once, I couldn't handle it anymore. The suspense, the silence, the not knowing. So I pushed myself over the edge, landing in a crouch by the water. My feet splashed, the sound way too loud in the still gorge, and I froze again, heart pounding. But no one came. Nothing moved. I stood slowly, scanning every ridge and shadow, every bush clinging to the cliffs. My eyes darted behind me, then back ahead. Nothing. So I started forward, step by step, up the gorge. The walls closed in tighter as I went, making me feel trapped, but I couldn't stop myself. Every few feet I'd pause, glance back, make sure I wasn't being followed. The rocks under my boots were slick, and more than once I almost slipped into the water. The stream was shallow here, but fast enough to sweep me off balance if I wasn't careful. The gorge twisted and bent, and each new corner felt like a test of nerve. Every bend could hide someone. Every overhang felt like a spot where someone could be crouched above, waiting. After what felt like hours but was probably only 20 minutes, I finally stopped. The gorge kept going, deeper and darker, but I couldn't. Something in my gut told me I'd pushed my luck too far already. I turned back, retracing my steps with the same slow caution, checking every angle, every shadow. The altar was still there when I passed it again, looming out of the water like it was watching me leave. When I finally scrambled back down the side of the waterfall, my legs were shaking so badly I almost lost my footing. The sound of the water masked every noise behind me, and that was the worst part. I couldn't tell if someone was following or not. I didn't stop moving until I was out of the gorge and back on the main trail, breathing so hard my chest hurt. Over the years, I've gone back around that area maybe a dozen times, following trails that cut near the gorge, but I've only stumbled on that place a few times since. Each time it looked a little different. Objects moved, new things left behind, old things gone. I've never gone back into the gorge itself. Not past that altar. The memory of that bank, those walls, those scattered objects, it sticks with me. Sometimes I wonder who built it, what it was for. If I'd just stumbled on some old forgotten ritual site or something worse. Something still in use and sometimes late at night. I wonder if anyone noticed me there that day, crouching and peeking around that bend. If anyone was watching from the cliffs above, silent and still, waiting for me to take one step too far. I'll never know. But I don't go near that gorge anymore. I've spent a lot of time alone in the woods over the years, but one stretch of time in particular stands out, and not because of some grand adventure or anything like that. It sticks with me because of how unsettling it became. How the smallest detail turned into something that could make my heart pound so hard in the dark that I thought I'd lose my breath. A friend of mine has about 40 acres outside of town. These days he's got it built up into a proper little farm. But back then, it was hardly more than neglected pasture land with some patches of trees and scrub here and there. He had a dozen chickens at most, and not much else besides some old fencing and a pump house with a rickety metal roof. It wasn't much to look at, but it was his, and he was slowly working on making it into something more livable. At the time, I was between jobs. Seasonal work had me bouncing around a bit, and he let me set up camp out there. I pitched a tent in a little clearing about in the middle of the land. To one side was a thicker patch of woods, the kind where the trees grew close enough together that the light barely made it down to the ground. To the other side was another thicket, different trees but just as dense, with vines and brush that made it tough to walk through. My little clearing felt tucked away, almost hidden. I carved out my own little homestead, a tent, a folding chair, a small fire ring, and a cooler that I kept stocked when I made runs into town. It wasn't glamorous, but I liked it. I liked being alone. My friend would come by every day to feed the chickens and check on things. But other than that, it was just me, the land, and the animals that called it home. If I didn't leave the property, I wasn't going to see another soul. And for a while, that suited me just fine. When you're out there that long, you start noticing everything in a way you just don't when you're surrounded by noise or other people. I found myself paying attention to the wind, to how it would bend certain grasses one way, or how it would sweep through the woods and carry sounds. I learned the difference between a squirrel scurrying through the leaf litter and the slower, heavier steps of a raccoon. I could tell when something was moving on 2 legs versus 4, and after a while, the nighttime noises that might spook someone else barely registered for me. That's not to say it was all peaceful. At first, every single sound set me on edge. The woods feel different at night, especially when you're the only person around for half a mile in every direction. A branch snaps and you think someone's standing there. Leaves crunch and you picture some stranger sneaking around. But after a month or so, your brain stops firing alarms at every rustle, and you settle into a rhythm. One thing that helped me adjust was that pump house. It was about 200 feet from my tent, a squat little building with a corrugated metal roof that my friend had slapped together in a hurry. He'd run short on nails, so the southeast corner of the roof wasn't secured properly. When the wind blew from the right direction, hard enough and steady enough, it would peel that corner of the roof up a bit, and then, when the gust passed, the metal would crash back down with a loud clang. The first few nights it startled me so badly I'd sit bolt upright in my sleeping bag, but eventually it became familiar. I knew the pattern. Wind in the trees, then the scrape and flap of the roof lifting, then the crash when it slapped back down. Funny thing is, I grew to find it comforting. Like how some people in the city say they can't fall asleep without the sound of traffic. That roof crash was a kind of reminder that the world was still moving outside my tent, that things were normal. It broke up the silence, and in a way it made me feel less alone. It was on one of those ordinary nights, after I'd been there about 2 months, that everything changed. I was lying in my sleeping bag, warm enough but not quite asleep yet. The woods were calm, the air still except for the occasional stirring in the leaves. I must have been right on the edge of drifting off when I heard it, the crash of the pump house roof. Loud and metallic, carrying clearly across the clearing. Nothing unusual. I probably didn't even open my eyes. But then, immediately after, I heard the sound again. Only this time it wasn't from the pump house. It was right outside my tent. It was the same noise, the same loud metallic crash, but wrong. It wasn't quite right, like someone imitating it. It had that hollow, forced quality, the way it sounds when you hear somebody trying to mimic a sound they've only half heard. For a moment, I froze completely. My body locked up, my eyes wide in the darkness. I didn't move a muscle. I couldn't. I knew without a doubt that my friend wasn't there. He always came during the day, hours earlier, and he never lingered after. And there was no reason, none, for any other person to be on that land at that hour. It wasn't like you could just wander onto it by mistake. You had to go out of your way to get there, and there was nothing on that land worth sneaking around for. I lay there listening, my heart thumping in my chest. A few seconds later, the wind picked up again, rattling the trees. Then came the real crash from the pump house, metallic and sharp. And once again, a few seconds after, came the mimic sound, right next to me. At that point, I knew what I had to do. I slid out of my sleeping bag as quietly as I could, my hands shaking. I grabbed my flashlight in one hand and the camp knife I kept close by in the other. My mouth was dry, my chest tight. I yanked open the zipper of the tent, my nerves buzzing, and stepped out into the cool night air. The clearing was dim, moonlight filtering through the thin clouds overhead. I swung the flashlight beam toward the edge of the woods where the sound had come from. The light cut through the brush, showing me bare branches, dead leaves, and patches of grass swaying in the breeze. Nothing. I moved the beam slowly, sweeping back and forth. The undergrowth wasn't thick enough to completely hide a person, not that close. If someone had been standing there, I would have seen them, no question. But the spot was empty. The leaves under the trees weren't disturbed. No fresh prints, no sign of movement. And yet I knew what I had heard. As I stood there, my breathing heavy, the pump house roof clanged again in the distance. My nerves jolted at the sound. And then, impossibly, terrifyingly, the fake crash echoed right next to me. I whipped the flashlight toward the sound. Every muscle in my body braced. The beam caught on something in the low branches of a tree. A bird. It was perched there at about eye level. Feathers catching the light, perfectly still except for its head tilting slightly. I froze, my chest heaving. The knife clenched so tightly my knuckles ached. And then, right as the beam stayed fixed on it, the bird opened its beak and let out that same metallic crashing sound. The exact fake version I'd been hearing. For a long moment, I just stood there, my adrenaline still screaming through me. The relief hit in waves, but it was tangled with frustration too. I'd been on the edge of believing something impossible, and it turned out to be a bird. Just a bird. I watched it for a while, the flashlight beam still steady on it. It shifted on the branch, fluffed its feathers, then stayed put, as calm as could be. I lowered the knife, though my hand still shook, and slowly backed toward my tent. That night I didn't sleep much. Every time the pump house roof banged, the mimic followed, right there at the edge of the clearing. The bird stayed for weeks after that, calling out the same eerie imitation. Eventually I got used to it the same way I had gotten used to the pump house roof. It became just another sound in the background of those nights. But I'll be honest, I never liked it. I never stopped resenting it, because in that moment, before I knew what it was, I felt something I hadn't felt before, even out there alone in the woods for months. I felt the deep certainty that I was not alone, that someone or something was right there in the dark, watching me. And that's not a feeling you forget. Even now, years later, when I think back on it, I can still remember that first instant I heard the mimic sound right outside my tent. The way my blood turned to ice, the way every nerve in my body screamed that something was wrong. And I know it was just a bird, probably a mockingbird doing what mockingbirds do. But that doesn't change what it felt like. That's the thing about being alone in the woods. It doesn't take much to make you doubt what you know, to make you question every sound. Sometimes all it takes is one noise, out of place, repeated in just the wrong way. And no matter how harmless the explanation turns out to be, you don't shake the memory of that fear. Not ever. I didn't expect the Yukon to feel so empty at night until I was actually standing there, staring at the open black sky, the air so cold and sharp it felt like glass when I inhaled. The day had been strange enough. My friend and I had decided to take advantage of a free dinner being hosted in Dawson by the church. Backpackers don't pass up free meals, especially not in the middle of nowhere. We had been out on the road for weeks, living on dry food, oats, nuts, and whatever we could scrape together from small-town stores. Sitting at a table with hot food in front of us had felt like heaven. The place had been friendly, warm, crowded with other travelers, locals, families. It was the kind of setting where you should have felt safe. But then there was Carl. He had drifted in as we were halfway through our plates, sliding down into the seat near us like he already knew us. He looked out of place in that small gathering, rough, older, with the kind of presence that makes your skin tighten before you know why. His clothes were rugged but dirty, layered in mismatched flannel, and a heavy jacket that looked like it hadn't been washed in years. His hair was long, streaked with gray, tied back loosely, and his eyes were the kind that seemed to hold on too long when they landed on you. He didn't smile in a way that made you feel welcomed, more in a way that made you feel measured. He asked where we were staying. We weren't stupid. Two girls on the road don't just hand that information out. We made something up, said we were at the main campsite, a safe, obvious answer. He leaned closer and said he knew the whole area like the back of his hand. He wanted details. Which spot? Which section? My stomach nodded while my friend played it off, shrugging like it didn't matter, keeping the lie going. I could feel his attention sticking to us in a way that no one else's did in that crowded hall. We finished eating quickly, our nerves buzzing, and tried to slip out unnoticed. But he was already at the door when we got there. He leaned against the frame, blocking the exit without fully blocking it, his voice low as he offered us a ride back. That was enough for us. We shook our heads, muttered no thanks, and forced our way past. I could feel his eyes on us the whole way across the lot, and I remember the way my hand shook when I fumbled with the car keys. The second we were inside, we locked the doors and started the engine. I told myself not to look in the mirror, but of course I did. He was standing there in the glow of the church lights, staring at us like he had all the time in the world. We pulled away fast. At first, the night swallowed us up in the way the Yukon always does. No streetlights, no glow of towns in the distance, nothing but the ribbon of black road and the white beams of our headlights cutting through it. We headed out of Dawson, aiming north, gravel crunching beneath the tires as we turned onto the road that would take us back toward where we planned to camp. The whole landscape out there feels like a different planet once you leave the town. Dense forest pressing in on both sides, the kind of silence that eats sound as soon as it leaves your mouth, and the heavy, constant reminder that there's no service, no one to call, no quick help. And that's when we noticed the truck. It didn't register right away. Just another pair of headlights far behind us at first. But every time we checked the mirror, they were still there. Not close enough to tailgate, not far enough to dismiss. Just following. The farther we got from Dawson, the clearer it became. We weren't imagining it. That truck was keeping pace, never passing, never falling away. The farther we went, the more wrong it felt. The Yukon doesn't have endless traffic, especially not on those back roads. You can drive for hours without seeing anyone, and the timing was too much of a coincidence. My chest tightened with the thought I'd been trying to push away since we left the church. Carl. My friend kept her hands locked on the wheel, eyes flicking to the rear view, knuckles white against the dark interior. We whispered about it without really saying much. There was nowhere to turn off, nowhere safe to stop. Even if we tried to pull over, we'd be stepping out into prime bear territory. Deep forest hugging a river. We'd just be trapped outside instead of trapped inside. So she pressed harder on the gas. The gravel spat beneath us, the headlights bouncing as the road twisted and narrowed. The truck stayed there. Not closer, not farther. Just waiting. The tension wound tighter with every kilometer. Then we hit snow. The road changed from bare gravel to a slick white sheet, ice packed hard into the surface. Patches of snow piling in ridges where tires had cut through. The car fishtailed as my friend tried to hold speed, her jaw set, determination warring with fear. We couldn't keep going like this. If we slid off, if we crashed, we'd be done. That's when we saw the campsite. It wasn't much, just a clearing, a few rough structures, and a central shelter standing like a dark shape against the trees. But to us it looked like salvation. My friend cut the wheel, pulled us in, and drove across to the far side of the road, hoping to throw off the truck's line of sight if it followed us in. We didn't wait. We grabbed what we could, tents, sleeping bags, food, the thick layers we needed if we had to sleep outside in the snow. We didn't even close the car doors. We just ran, stumbling across the uneven ground toward the shelter, breath burning in our throats. And then we weren't alone. The shelter was already occupied. A family, 12 of them, huddled inside around lantern light and the smell of wood smoke. 8 men, 4 women, all of them turning as we burst in, swearing and gasping, panic spilling out of us before we could stop. The sight of so many strangers should have been overwhelming, but instead it felt like we had run straight into safety. When we got the words out that someone had been following us for over 100 kilometers, the entire energy shifted. The men moved instantly, grabbing knives, hiking poles, cans of bear spray, anything that could serve as a weapon. They poured out of the shelter like a wave. The women grabbed our arms, urged us to move, pointing toward a dense patch of trees at the edge of the campsite. They told us to run, to hide deep in the brush, away from sight. We didn't question it. We just followed, stumbling through the snow, the forest swallowing us with its frozen branches. The cold bit deep, but we pushed through until the trees closed over us. We crouched there, shaking, trying to listen through the pounding of our hearts. The sounds from the camp carried faintly. Men shouting, a car alarm blaring, sharp and jarring in the stillness. Then silence. Heavy, total silence. I looked at my friend, her face pale, her eyes wide and wet. We were in the northern Yukon, miles from anything. No service, no help, no backup plan. It was 10 degrees, and our only line of safety had just gone head to head with the man we had been running from all night. Time stretched. 30 minutes felt like 3 hours. The cold crept in through every gap in my clothes, my body trembling with both fear and chill. When the women finally decided to return, we went with them, hearts hammering. The men were there, alive, waiting in the glow of lantern light. They told us what happened. Carl had been there. He had shouted that we weren't anyone's business, that we had wronged him somehow. His words slurred with anger. He had smashed the window of our car, then stormed off, his truck roaring back down the road. One of the men had followed for nearly 20 kilometers before turning back, confirming that Carl hadn't stopped nearby, hadn't waited in the shadows. The relief was crushing. That night, the women spread their blankets and insisted we sleep within their circle. The warmth of their campfire, the sound of steady breathing all around, the sense of numbers. It was the first time I felt safe since we'd left Dawson. In the morning, we stood in the pale light staring at the damage to our car. Glass glittered in the snow, the interior stiff with frost. It could have been so much worse. The thought kept circling in my mind as I breathed in the icy air. Out there, far from everything, anything could happen. If it hadn't been for that family, if we had been alone in the dark with Carl pressing closer, I don't know how the night would have ended. Instead, it ended with safety. With human kindness, raw and immediate. With the realization that in a place as empty and unforgiving as the Yukon, other people can mean the difference between surviving the night and vanishing into it. And as we drove away later that morning, the frost still clinging to the windshield, I carried a new kind of appreciation. Not just for the wilderness or the beauty of being so far from the rest of the world, but for the luck of running into people who chose to stand between us and something darker. I've never forgotten how close that night came to being something else entirely.